Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. This week, I'm so excited because we are doing another Heated Rivalry Q&A, and I have some great questions this week to discuss with you all and talk about in detail. So I'm just going to jump right into it. There are a handful here. I tried to lay them out in a way where we talk about them and it flows into one another. There are a few hockey-specific ones. There are a few pertaining to season 2. And then another one that kind of ties into a greater theme of season 1. So lots to dive into, plenty to sink our teeth into, and hopefully you'll have some commentary around it and leave me a comment because I'd love to chat with everybody and get to hear their thoughts. So without further ado, let's dive into this week's Heated Rivalry Q&A. So this first question I was very excited to talk about. I actually got a DM and I had a discussion with this person in the DMs, and then I asked if I could talk about it on the podcast in greater detail and kind of flesh out my opinion. So it says, "Hi Kay, I've listened to all your podcasts and have enjoyed them so much. Please keep them coming. I have a question, or maybe it's more of an observation. It seems odd to me that when Shane proposed his plan to Ilya about leaving Boston to play for Ottawa, at no time did they ever have a conversation about what that would mean for Ilya's career. They never discussed or even simply acknowledged the fact that Ilya leaving Boston would completely implode his career. We do not find out until the long game just how bottom of the barrel Ottawa is, but they would know that. It seems that Shane might have said, 'I realize what an astronomical sacrifice this would be for you and that you would be giving up so much, but at least we can be together.' To me, that as a generational player at the top of their game, this is something that they should have acknowledged. It feels like a complete omission that they didn't. Thoughts?" So I have lots of thoughts actually on this, and I'm excited to touch on it. So when I was breaking down my answer to this, the biggest thing that I found to be the crux of this argument, or the angle that this person is coming at, is how hockey functions so differently in each of these characters' lives. So Ilya, in particular, his identity was never wrapped up fully in hockey. It was very much a way for him to escape his dad and Russia, but as a person, he was never fully in love with hockey emotionally like Shane. I would say structurally, though, his life is very much built around hockey, but that's more because of the nature of the sport itself, less so by choice. And that's not to say he doesn't care about hockey, because we do see how him not winning wears on him during the long game, because he is a competitor, and that doesn't change when he goes to Ottawa. But the way hockey is positioned in his life is entirely different than how Shane views hockey in his own life, because Shane's identity is hockey. And that distinction leads to this sort of how could they not understand each other moment that we get to see play out in the long game. For Shane, hockey is the framework through which he understands himself. He learned what it means and feels like to be legitimized through hockey. And as a sport, it also has taught him what it means to be disciplined, how to belong, and it shaped his value system. And so his entire life is built around his hockey achievements, his hockey legacy, his consistency as a player, and obviously all of his accolades too, because those serve as external proof for him. Because as an Asian player in a sport that's predominantly white, he would have had to be undeniable every step of his career. And that would have been something that becomes psychologically necessary for him, because for Shane, his statistics and the legacy and the accolades that he has, that protects him in a way from racism, or at the very least provides him the feeling of safety from it. And it also serves as evidence of his legitimacy and belonging in a space and a sport that typically does not allow space for him there, because it is such a predominantly white sport. That is already heavy before you even introduce him being gay. So you can understand why he has such this interesting dichotomy between being a hockey player and wanting to fit in, but then at the core of everything, he knows he never will. And it helps us understand why his sort of immortality within hockey matters so deeply for him, because I think it's so tied to his own self-worth, because to him, his accomplishments and his statistics are the only thing that he has to justify all of the sacrifices that he's made to be a part of this sport that has long made him feel excluded. Ilya didn't build himself in the same way. He doesn't need hockey to exist. To him, the sport provided him freedom and money and cars and the ability to move away from Russia and his father and not have to depend on him for anything anymore. But it also gave him Shane, and he recognizes that too. So for him, he gets more fulfillment out of his connections with people and less so out of his accomplishments. And it's why we see him in every other book of the series interacting with these other characters. It's because Ilya likes people and the connections he can build with them. So in the long game, Ilya doesn't have hockey and he is sad, yes. But that's also because he doesn't have Shane or a community or any outside connections. And so where most of the time the argument is made that Ilya's unhappiness is framed around him being demoted to Ottawa, I would say most of his sadness is actually over not having Shane, being isolated from people, and obviously his undiagnosed depression. The hockey component is last on that list. And it's not until he and Troy and Harris start to build a friendship that we see things start to shift for him. And then it shifts again when he goes to therapy. And it shifts again when we see him starting to connect with his teammates again in the locker room and be a better captain. And so Ilya is often viewed as someone who goes around identifying all these queer characters and making connections with them because they're queer. But Jacobs pointed out in an interview that I think really encapsulates this nicely. Ilya is just an empathetic person, and he connects to people on an emotional level and figures out what's troubling them as a human. And when he connects with people emotionally like that, it's largely over shared experiences or traumas, like in the situation with Troy, where they are able to connect over their fathers. And that trust that he builds with Troy over that leads to Troy coming out to him on his own. The same happens with Ryan Price and Ilya's ability to notice that hockey doesn't make him happy anymore and creating that safe environment for those people to open up to him. The queer part is secondary to their human struggles and Ilya's desire to help them with those. And so his connections always supersede that person simply being a teammate or another player. He wants to connect with people on a deeper level. And we see that with Troy, and it brings him more fulfillment in his life that fills the gaps when Shane is not around him. And I think it's normal that people are shocked that Shane is the one to suggest Ilya throw his career away in the first place, and that he would be in denial over what he's asking him to do, because if the roles were reversed, asking Shane to go to a lesser team would be unfathomable to him. He would say no because he wants to win cups, and Shane thinks Ilya does too, because at that point in the story, they've still not talked about how they truly feel about hockey. It is a monumental thing to assume Ilya will agree to this plan. Obviously, people are wondering how he could come to this conclusion and think it's fair, because if Ilya were to ask this of Shane, we all know he would mull over it and question why he would even ask him to do that in the first place. And that does come up in the long game when Ilya tells Shane that he had already chosen him, and it had not even registered to Shane yet what a huge sacrifice Ilya had made for them when he left Boston and goes to Ottawa. I think Shane views this as a practical decision, and Ilya recognizes that it's quite literally him rearranging his entire life for Shane. But if you dropped Shane in Ottawa, he would not have the same struggles as Ilya because he's from there. He has a structural support system that he doesn't even realize Ilya does not have. And Shane is not the social person that Ilya is. In Montreal, he does not have what Ilya has in Boston. He would not languish in the same way with that social isolation. So Shane cannot conceptualize how hard it actually would be for Ilya. And he's also unaware that Ilya is struggling with depression and isolation because Ilya doesn't tell him anything. Counterintuitively, hockey is more important to Shane, but he does not thrive off of recognition in the same way that Ilya does. He Ilya thrives off of personal connections more than career achievements. Meanwhile, Shane can continue on and function better because he's still in Montreal and he's sustained by his achievements in hockey in a way that Ilya has never been sustained by hockey. Shane wins his third cup in the year between Heated Rivalry and the long game, and Montreal is still winning all through the long game. And so if his personal life with Ilya feels like it's in shambles, he can still function because his professional life is going well. And so when this all transpires, I think Shane has tunnel vision because on the couch, he needs to find a solution to Ilya marrying Svetlana. And so his tunnel is from the couch to we'll figure something out. And then he figures this out. And then Ilya says yes. So there isn't a lot of thinking about the big picture implications in that moment. It's very much a matter of him finding some sort of solution to their problem right then and there. And he can't conceptualize that there is more to this than just checking off that box, because this to him is the easiest and quickest way for the two of them to see each other more. And that is his priority. And now that they have both had a taste of what it feels like to be together, Shane wants to find any solution he can to preserve it. In a lot of ways, Ilya leads Shane to this plan because he tells him he wants to be on a Canadian team. So that already narrows things down to 7 teams to choose from. And then he eliminates Montreal right off the bat. And they both know that they don't want it to be a Western Conference team because that would mean that they would only play each other twice a year instead of 4 times a year. That's something that's more fleshed out in the books and not brought up in the show. So essentially that leaves you with Toronto or Ottawa. And Ottawa is closer and within driving distance. So after Ilya spends all day, and it's actually a few days in the books, heavily implying what he wants, Shane comes to the conclusion that he should play for Ottawa, and that's not a stretch by any means. He basically hands Shane this decision on a platter, and then Ilya says, okay. So in reality, it's kind of both of them coming to this conclusion, even though it feels like it's Shane coming to this conclusion on his own, laying awake all night thinking about how to solve their problem. And I think the fact that Ilya leads him to a very narrow option for them is such a huge component of this argument that Ilya truly does not care, because this is now 10 years in the making almost, and Shane is all he wants emotionally. So when Shane finally says that he wants to be together, I think Ilya would go literally anywhere if it meant that he gets to have Shane. And for him, their emotional connection is what he needs to survive more than he needs hockey. So he will put himself in any position necessary in order to facilitate that. And that is what Ilya signs up for, because even at the table with Shane's parents, Ilya's not the one saying that they're going to wait to come out after their careers are over. So that is another piece of this part of his misery, which is that Shane is still so restrictive after the fact, even when he moves to Ottawa and he's made this sacrifice and it's made him more isolated than he was before. He didn't realize that that was part of this gamble because all he cared about was having Shane. And there really aren't that many real world examples of players leaving a team like Boston and going to a lesser quality team. I would say the only one I could come up with was Johnny Hockey when he left Calgary and he went to Columbus because he wanted to be closer to his family. And he essentially downgraded teams in order to put his family in a better position logistically, and he liked that club. But the difference being he didn't stay in his own conference. And so I think it's like a really interesting thing to think about a player like Sidney Crosby or Alex Ovechkin leaving the Pens or the Capitals to go play for a division rival lesser team, because the public opinion would be so negative and confused. And again, there's not a lot of modern examples I can think of where people are choosing to go to a team like this. A lot of the times they're traded there, but it's not a choice like this. And I also think about Brad Marchand when he was traded from the Bruins and he was our captain. That was horrible as a Bruins fan. We were up in arms at our management and upper management for that trade. And it was very much framed like we were removing a limb from his body. He did not want to leave Boston. that's sort of what it would feel like in this scenario if Ilya Rozanov, your captain, actively chose to not even do contract negotiations and stay and went to a division rival and is playing against Boston 4 times a year. It would just be very confusing for everybody. And again, I think that it's such a great literary device as someone who understands hockey that she's put these characters in this position because it really, really would be highly controversial for everybody involved. I think this leads us really effortlessly into the next question I got, which is it normal for someone to become a captain so young? Because in the book, Shane and Ilya were teenagers. Is it because they are centers? How does that work? I really liked this question as a hockey player myself because I think this is a topic of conversation that has actually come up quite often in the hockey world pertaining to the ages of captains, because captains traditionally are veteran players, but it's becoming more of a trend that younger players are named as team captains. And there's a lot of back and forth over this because being named captain of your team is very important. It's a hugely defining moment for a club because the selection can have a direct effect on the team's performance. And the captain is a reflection of the room. And in many aspects, it's also a reflection of the franchise. And so captains traditionally can be named by popular vote, but sometimes they are chosen by management, or sometimes they can be named because of seniority or loyalty to the team. And those types of situations, you're sort of immortalized by being named captain. But other times, the franchise will choose someone they see as their franchise player, which is another way of calling someone their star player or their player of the future for the team. And a lot of times, that person is who they select in the draft. So when you select a draft pick in the first round, that player sometimes can jump right up into the NHL right away instead of going to the minors for a few years to mature. Those players are often considered generational talents, like Shane and Ilya are in the book series. And it's very difficult to be 19 or 20 and play in the NHL, not only because of your relative size, playing against men, but also the speed of the game is such a big transition for a lot of players, and it takes a while for them to become accustomed to the pace. So when a team has a player like Shane or Ilya who is capable of playing in the league right away, but then is also successful right away, they've selected that player knowing that they will be building their roster around that player for years to come. And a player like that is considered a key piece of the puzzle when it comes to trying to win a Stanley Cup. So decisions for the team are being made with that player in mind and putting players around their star in order to give them the best chance of winning. The closest example I thought might be easy for people to understand, at least in the more modern era of hockey, is Connor McDavid, who is actually one of the players that Hudson himself has cited that he used as inspiration when building the character of Shane. And Connor McDavid is the youngest named captain in NHL history. He was 19 years, 266 days old when he was named captain of the Edmonton Oilers. And he is still the captain of the Edmonton Oilers. And he is largely considered one of the greatest players of all time. So definitely a generational talent, much like Shane and Ilya are depicted as. And if we use him as a means of comparison, to put it in perspective, he was granted what's called exceptional player status in 2012 by Hockey Canada. And that actually allowed him to begin playing junior hockey at age 15. And so that status basically allows skilled underage hockey players to enter into the major junior league earlier than they naturally would. But there's only been 9 players as of 2024 who have been granted that exceptional status, and he's one of them. Connor McDavid was selected first overall by the Edmonton Oilers in the 2015 NHL entry draft, and he joined the Oilers in their 2015-16 season. He ended up getting hurt. He was out for 3 months, and he was still named to the NHL All-Rookie team and was a finalist for the Calder Memorial Trophy, which is the Rookie of the Year trophy. When he signed in July of 2015, he signed a 3-year entry-level contract with the team. And the total for that deal was $11.3 million, and he had up to $3.75 million annually in bonus incentives. So that's if you score this many goals or have this many points, you get bonus incentives. That next season, he was 19 years old, and the Oilers named him as their captain. And like I said, he's been their captain ever since. He had 100 points in his 2016-17 season when he was aged 20. He became the second youngest player to win the Art Ross Trophy, which is the trophy you win when you lead the league in scoring. He was also awarded the Hart Memorial Trophy, which is the MVP of the regular season for the whole league. He also won the Ted Lindsay Award, which is the MVP of the league as voted by the NHL Players Association. And he was also selected to the NHL First All-Star Team. Does that sound familiar to anyone? In terms of youngest players to ever be named captain, like I said, Connor McDavid is the youngest at 19 years, 266 days. The next one is Gabriel Landeskog. He is from the Colorado Avalanche. He was 19 years, 286 days old. Sidney Crosby was 19 years, 297 days old when he was named captain of the Pittsburgh Penguins back in 2007. There's also Vincent Lecavalier and Jonathan Toews. The youngest player to win the Stanley Cup as captain was Sidney Crosby. He was 21 when the Penguins won in 2009. I would say that this new trend of young captains is more so from the 2000s on. It was not this way in the 80s or the 90s. Just to give you a little more information on kind of the nature of captaincy in the NHL, the captain is the only player allowed to speak with the referees about rule interpretations. If they're not on the ice, though, the alternate captain can do that. He's also the person that would convey any of the players' concerns to management. He is considered the representative of the team to the general public. They would often be associated with the team's social functions or raising money, doing any sort of philanthropy work. They are present for any sort of on-ice or off-ice functions that the team puts on, award presentations, ceremonial face-offs, things of that nature. An example, I would say, of a team building around their franchise player is Connor Bedard, who plays for Chicago. He's someone who they threw all their chips at and named him captain right away. And that's a lot of responsibility to give someone who's that young and doesn't necessarily have any experience in the league. But we don't know how the rooms are managed because I think there's this unspoken rule that your captain is your leader, but there's also a lot of veteran players that might not even have a letter that can be very outspoken and lead in their own ways in the locker room. This new trend, I think, is largely brought on by management teams who really want to make these franchise player the face of their team, and they flash that franchise player around to make themselves more alluring and enticing for other players to come and play on the left or the right side of the franchise guy. But it also makes it so that the guys who are alternate captains can be more leaders behind the scenes. There's also situations like what happened with Quinn Hughes, who was the captain of Vancouver, and he actually left Vancouver, even though he was captain, to go to Minnesota. So he left a team in the Pacific and went to a team in the Central. So again, different than what Ilya does. He left his division. He's not playing in the same division that he left as captain. But a lot of times, naming a player as captain, if they want to leave, they'll find a way out of their contract. And so management naming people as captain, it's not necessarily a way to entice them to stay, even though it is considered a really great honor to be the face of a franchise. Those guys are going to go where they're wanted, and they're going to go where they're taken care of. And so you can have captains leave a franchise if they're unhappy. A lot of times you'll see teams name the best player on their team as the captain because it's sort of this unspoken rule, but I don't necessarily think that should always be the case. In a lot of instances, it's still what happens. It's not always the person who has the most sway in the room or is the most heavily respected. It kind of feels like this is very much just a new trend from management teams. But on the flip side, of course, it's a role that comes with a lot of responsibility and pressure too. And we see that in the long game for Ilya because he's the captain of a team that's losing. But we also see it for Shane when he's leading Montreal his whole career on a team that's winning. There's a lot of things that come packaged into being a captain and being a good captain that I don't think the general public sees or would be aware of. So, this next question is male hockey culture feels borderline cruel, given that Shane only gets 2 weeks off a year. When player plays through broken bones and plays injured in the playoffs, that also feels cruel, like how Ilya played through bruised ribs. Is there any sort of physical culture associated with hockey? So, hockey is a notoriously tough and physical culture, especially at the professional level, where playing through injuries is often seen as part of the job or even a badge of honor. During the playoffs, in particular, players routinely will compete through injuries and pain. And it's like how we see Ilya playing with bruised ribs in the show. In the NHL, many players play with fractures, torn ligaments. They can dislocate things. They'll get stitches. They are missing teeth. And those stories are often celebrated publicly afterwards. Once a team's eliminated from the playoffs, there's actually a big reveal of all the injuries each player on the team had sustained during the series. At the same time, it does raise fair questions about whether the culture can become unhealthy or overly demanding. And this is reiterated in that second part of the question, which pointed out that Shane was given limited time off in the off season by saying he gets 2 weeks off per year. I think this is indicative of the pressure players may feel to prioritize team success over their own long-term health, potentially. There's definitely an ongoing conversation in sports around where the line is between toughness, expectation, and player well-being. And hockey culture is kind of its own beast. So I also don't think that players view it as making a sacrifice in the same way that outsiders might in any elite sport, but hockey especially, playing through pain is deeply embedded into the culture. And I personally experienced that in women's hockey as well. The mindset that you have is that you want to compete at the highest level and win, and you will do whatever you can to stay on the ice. It's also another huge aspect of hockey culture and example of how deeply team-oriented the sport is, because hockey players are conditioned from a young age to think about the group and the team first and not the individual. So when guys play hurt, it's often not because they feel exploited to, but because they genuinely do not want to let their teammates down and they want to contribute however they can. In hockey especially, there's a mentality that everyone is sacrificing something for the team, whether that's pain or exhaustion or just your personal comfort level. That mindset definitely feels like it's part of the identity of the sport. And I get that how to outsiders it can look very extreme, but within the culture, it feels like part of your commitment and loyalty to your team and the expectation of doing everything possible to help the group win. That's a given. So that doesn't necessarily mean the culture is always healthy. There are definitely conversations now about long-term player wellness and whether athletes are being pushed too far. But at the end of the day, they do have team doctors and medical staff who evaluate injuries. But if a player lies or if the player insists that they want to be out there, the doctors and the trainers will do what they can to assist them in that. So many players will get a cut on the ice. They'll go in the locker room, get stitches, and be out there the next shift. That's not something that they're feeling forced to do emotionally. It's genuinely a part of the identity and mentality that they've grown up with from a very young age. And as for the time off, in the show, Shane says he only gets 2 weeks off per year. NHL players typically get 3 to 4 months of off season, which is, mid-May to September, depending on if you go into the playoffs or not. But this is rarely true rest because they still need to train daily. They still need to stay in shape or get stronger or recover from injury that they sustained in the regular season. For characters like Shane, though, he also has a lot of obligations through his sponsorships and brand deals and stuff. So when he talks about taking those into account and only having 2 weeks off a year, I would say that his work is not strictly training. It also includes any sort of work with those brand deals. Personally, for me, while playing in college, we had our regular season, then we would have 1 week off, and then we would start our spring workouts. That week off was something we were told we had, but it was sort of an unspoken expectation that you shouldn't take it off. So we would train all spring with our weightlifting workouts since the ice was taken out of the rink, and then all summer we had our lifting schedules and workout plans that we were expected to maintain before we came back for testing in the fall. A lot of this is not strictly enforced, but it's something you uphold yourself because as a player, you know that in order to be better the following season, you have to put in the work during the off season. And I would not say this is exclusive to hockey, but really to any athletes at the collegiate, semi-pro, or professional level who truly want to be the best. They just know that that's what it takes to get there. And your time is a sacrifice that you make in order to be great. This next question made me laugh. It says, in episode 3, when Scott and Shane talk, Scott spits on the ice and Shane spits back. Is that a part of hockey culture? So some things that look strange or even gross to people who are outside of the sport, like spitting on the ice, it makes me laugh because I almost don't even notice it anymore. And I'd say, yes, this can be tied into the culture in a similar way to baseball players chewing on gum or sunflower seeds. They're often spitting on the ice, spitting over the bench, spitting on the bench. In that scene, they both spit onto the ice. And while I can see how it may look like Scott spits at Shane, I never read it that way myself. He's bent over, very out of breath, breathing heavy. When you skate like that and play in a game like that and have a hard shift, a lot of times your spit can get kind of heavy in your throat. And I think a lot of guys just spit it out. They also have half shields on, so that makes it easier to do that. I personally never spit, but that's because I find it gross. But I also had a full cage in front of my space. So if I were to spit, it would probably hit the cage anyways, and that's disgusting. But yeah, just like any high endurance sport, when you're breathing heavy, a lot of people find that they have a buildup of spit sometimes, and they just spit it out onto the ice, especially since the rink is cold. So imagine running outside in cold air. Your body itself is never cold because you're exerting so much energy and you're sweating, but the air in your lungs is cold because of the temperature of the rink. And there's also a lot of times where players will squirt their water into their mouths and then spit the water back out onto the ice. I think sometimes it's because you don't want to drink too much water and get a cramp, so you spit it out. I've seen a lot of my teammates do that, but sometimes it's also just to flush out your mouth. So I don't think it's unique to hockey. I think there are people who spit in a lot of sports. But yeah, as someone who's played, I can understand how players would get in the habit of doing it, just given how your throat can feel after a really long shift or a really long game. Like, it totally makes sense to me that there would be a buildup of it. All right, this question is, what are your thoughts on Jacob announcing that a majority of an episode will feature Mozart's Requiem? Can't wait to talk about this. I was thrilled that he said this in an interview. And I wanted to give a little bit of context into Mozart's Requiem because it's actually a very fascinating piece of music. And historically, there's a lot of really cool, nuancy facts about it that I think people might be interested in. So Mozart's Requiem in D minor is a really interesting piece of history, mainly because of the circumstances surrounding the piece itself. So in 1791, Mozart was commissioned to write a Requiem mass for a nobleman, and evidently the man that commissioned him was known for paying the composers to write the music and then claiming the music as his own later on. And at the time that Mozart was commissioned for this piece, he was ill. And he became very consumed by the work once he began. And according to his widow, he began to believe that he was actually composing the music for his own funeral, which is very ominous considering he died at age 35 before he was able to finish it. The fact that it was unfinished actually became part of the lore, and Mozart fully completed only a few sections of the score and had left bits and pieces like vocal lines and sketches for the rest of it. And so he had a student named Franz, who completed the piece after Mozart's death so that the man who commissioned it would be able to pay Mozart's wife, Constance, for it. And to this day, there's still a lot of debate over exactly how much of the final version was truly Mozart's work and how much of it was his students. Because Mozart did not complete the work himself, a lot of historians actually feel like the Requiem has a sort of haunted quality to it, not only because of the subject matter it's dealing with, which is death, but listeners also know he died while writing it, so that adds to that haunted quality. The song that's probably the most famous is Lacrimosa, and it's tied to that same sort of mythology because Mozart only had completed the first 8 bars of that song before his death. And that song sort of like haunts the narrative in many ways. Over time, there was a lot of storytelling behind the work that I think has become more romanticized in large part through film and fiction. A lot of people depict the story as though the work sort of psychologically taunted Mozart into writing his own funeral mass. That notion has been disproved, but I think that stories and lore like that have very much made the Requiem itself and each of the songs within it have this very deep association with obsession and mortality and doom. And it's a big reason why a lot of filmmakers and television creators use it so often, because it has an instant effect when you hear a lot of the songs from the Requiem and the notes from it in particular. I think even audiences who don't know classical music can feel through its sound that they're meant to evoke certain emotions while listening to the Requiem. The notes used throughout it are often described as apocalyptic or tragic or sacred. It's made of different sections. All of them can be used in very different ways in film and TV. So there's moments that can be used for depicting something chaotic, like a battle or a war scene, or even someone having a mental break. Then there's songs like Lacrimosa, which instantly bring you into the feeling of grief or mourning. It feels more intimate, which would make it ideal for using in scenes that cover funerals or heavy emotional moments, death. And then, the opening, Intruitus, has this solemn, ritualistic feeling that can make scenes feel kind of spiritually heavy or timeless. And the beauty of using an instrumental piece of music like classical music in film and television is that the music itself can provide a really interesting contrast because visually we are being shown something specific, but the music can make us feel something we may not be seeing as clearly on screen. So emotions in particular are hard to show an audience without the character saying them outright. But music, and in particular classical music, can be the vehicle used to make the emotional undertones clear in the absence of words. So a lot of the time, songs like the ones in the Requiem can draw a really beautiful parallel between the beautiful and terrible parts of humanity. And in this case, Mozart's music is described as elegant and human and meant to celebrate parts of life that can be beautiful despite the subject matter being death itself, since it is a requiem, which is literally a composition or Catholic mass used to lay the souls of the dead to rest. Knowing that this is the intention behind the music helps to create a lot of tension, and it lets directors like Jacob use it in multiple ways depending on the scene. So even though in a literal sense it's a funeral composition, it can be used by him sincerely or literally for flashbacks of funerals, or it could be used ironically. It can be used to depict spirituality or a heavy emotional moment between characters, or even for a single character on their own. It can be used in moments where they're depicting dark and ugly moments of trauma and grief, or even potentially satire. In regards to Heated Rivalry and Jacob saying he plans to use this for the majority of an episode in season 2, I have a handful of moments I feel this can slot into. For me, chapters 22 through 24 of The Long Game feel like they could be one episode, and the emotional core of those chapters feels consistent with the themes of the Requiem, along with Jacob creatively finding ways to intertwine Ilya's mother and father wounds, or his therapy, and his deepening depression. So I think Most people assign this news to the plane scene, but I do not personally. If he uses it there, I wouldn't be surprised per se, but I do not think that's where it would be the most impactful, honestly. The plane scene will make us feel those emotions visually because it's an event and an action that is happening to Ilya, but the music from the Requiem would, in my opinion, be most effective in his moments of solitude, where nothing is happening to him per se. He is simply feeling and not speaking, and we are meant to enter into that pain alongside him and can have the music be an entry point to that. This next question I really loved. It says, Ilya's father calls him lazy in episode 1, and in the tuna melt scene, Ilya calls himself lazy. Does lazy represent something I might be missing? I keep thinking about that. He is a professional athlete and obviously not lazy, as in lazy might be a replacement for another word, like when Shane calls Ilya an asshole or when Ilya calls Shane boring. So I loved this topic. I really, really liked writing about this. In the book, Ilya's father does not call Ilya lazy. So this is a show-specific edition, and I find it absolutely brilliant because it creates this really impactful narrative payoff in the tuna melt scene in episode 4. The overarching theme in the book, though, is that Ilya's father shames him. He belittles him. He puts him down. In his presence, Ilya describes himself as a trembling child who is awaiting punishment. And so I interpret his father's choice of words as connective tissue between Ilya and his mother, because his father was very hard on his mother, who suffered from depression, and I find it very likely he called her lazy too, which Ilya would have heard. And so to be called lazy himself when he's very clearly not would be exceptionally cutting for him. I feel even more strongly about that theory when I put it in context of Ilya's internal dialogue in the long game, where he struggles to get out of bed and recognizes that he's always tired, and he thinks to himself that he may be depressed and plays it off because it's not like he stays in bed all day crying, and remembers that neither did his mother. So I think when he's talking with Galina in therapy, he recalls his mother was often resting. It doesn't feel like a stretch for me to imagine that Gregory called her lazy. Do I think he means it in a literal sense? No, because clearly Ilya is not lazy. But to Gregory, I think Ilya is representative of a lot of his resentment. Perhaps Ilya, being so similar to his mother, was the root of that resentment, and so he spoke to him as he spoke to her. And lazy embodies a multitude of emotions like resentment and bitterness and indignation, maybe, or envy, possibly. I certainly think envy can be found in how Alexei speaks to Ilya. And in both the book and the show, there's an emphasis on how Shane is very serious about his training, his diet, his performance, and Ilya has a more lax approach to hockey. While he smokes and he parties and he goes out during the summers, and he has a much more lax feeling towards hockey in general. The low-hanging fruit would be to associate his behavior with being lazy, but we also rarely have a scene where we see Shane training that isn't mirrored with Ilya training. And so while he has this stereotype of being this cocky Russian assigned to him, while Shane is described by Ilya himself as everything the league wanted from their stars, Ilya's aware of that discrepancy between the two of them. He's aware and he knows that he is cocky. He knows that he is painted as the bad boy to Shane's perfect image. But there's also the reality I think he's often blinded to because of the comparisons made between them, which is that he works just as hard as Shane does behind the scenes. So in the lead up to Ilya calling himself lazy in the tuna melt scene, he says he thinks he will find someone else, but he is lazy. So to me, lazy read as one of those moments where he's saying something emotionally honest without being able to fully say it out loud yet. So what he means is, I actually already found the person I want. I don't need to go out and find someone else. Because at that point, Ilya's already chosen Shane, whether he's consciously ready to admit it or not. And because of that, he has no interest in looking for someone else in Boston. But Shane only hears the part where Ilya says he thinks he will find someone else and misses the subtext in the part about him being lazy, preventing him from finding that other person on purpose. Framing it as laziness also becomes a way for Ilya to hide the vulnerability of what he's actually confessing. And the whole day and lead up to the tuna melt scene, Ilya is terrified. So we see him walk up to the edge of honesty multiple times, but never fully jump over the line until he says Shane's name out loud. He wants Shane to understand that there is no one else for him, but neither of them is emotionally ready to confront that directly yet. And so what makes the scene even more meaningful is how it opens the door for their relationship to deepen emotionally in a way Shane is actually unaware of. Because in a moment of self-deprecation, Ilya uses a word that has clearly been weaponized against him before by his father for years. Lazy isn't just a throwaway comment, because for Ilya, it's tied to his identity and also the shame he feels within himself and hasn't fully dealt with yet. So when Shane immediately rejects that notion and doesn't accept him using the word lazy in regards to himself, Shane is starting to actually dismantle something within Ilya. And as viewers, we know that Ilya has never been lazy when it comes to Shane, especially in the way he pursues Shane and approaches their relationship. He planned the commercial in Toronto in order to see him right away, but it goes beyond the romance too, because Shane takes hockey and his career incredibly seriously. So for him to say something like that to Ilya carries a lot of weight. Shane sees him as someone who is driven in every aspect of his life. He's not lazy with his game. He's not passive when it comes to things or people he wants. Ilya goes after what he wants and takes initiative instead of waiting for things to happen. And it becomes a really beautiful moment where Shane unintentionally begins to reframe the meaning of the word that Ilya has attached to himself negatively for most of his life. So I'm going to end the podcast episode there. I absolutely loved this spread of questions. I think there was a good, healthy combination of hockey ones, talking about season 2, music, and really insightful angles that people are taking about Shane and Ilya's characters and what they are written like. And I love talking about that. I think that's one of the things I love deep diving into the most. So as always, if you sent in a question, thank you so much. I appreciate it endlessly. It's so much fun to discuss questions with people. And if you want to send in a question, please feel free to leave me any question at all in my DMs or on any of my socials. And as always, if you've made it to the end, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next chat together in an upcoming episode.